Frank Delaney sat quietly at Gate 27 of Denver International Airport. It was early, barely 6:30 a.m., but the terminal was already busy. People rushed past with coffee cups and carry-ons, but Frank remained still. He wasn't distracted by phones or loud conversations. His hands rested gently in his lap, and his posture was upright, showing signs of both age and discipline. At 78 years old, Frank looked like any other elderly man in travel clothes, a soft tan jacket, black slacks, and worn-out walking shoes. But to those who paid close attention, there was more to him. A slight limp in his step and a stiffness in his left knee hinted at a deeper story, one that didn't come from old age, but from the battlefield. Frank wasn't flying for business or vacation. He was headed to Annapolis, Maryland to witness something incredibly important: his granddaughter's graduation from the U.S. Naval Academy. She was the first in the family to follow in his military footsteps, and Frank wasn't going to miss it. Despite living on a small, fixed pension, he paid extra for an aisle seat, one for CB, because of his knee injury. The seat had just enough legroom to make the 5-hour flight bearable. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. As his boarding group was called, Frank made his way onto the plane without fuss. He thanked the gate agent, held the railing tightly as he walked down the jet bridge, and carefully lowered himself into his assigned seat. He placed his small duffel bag under the seat in front of him, exhaled deeply, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. The worst part of traveling boarding was over, or so he thought. Just a few rows ahead, a woman was waving down a flight attendant. Her name tag read Kayla, and she had the polished look of someone used to dealing with passengers and problems. Kayla leaned in to speak with the woman, tapped her tablet, and then looked around the cabin. Her expression shifted slightly as she turned and walked straight toward Frank. "Excuse me, sir," she said, softly but firmly. "Are you seated in 14C?" Frank looked up, slightly confused. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "We have a family that got separated during booking," she explained. "A mother with 2 young kids. Your seat, along with the 2 next to it, is the only spot where they can all sit together." Frank furrowed his brow. "I booked this seat months ago," he said. "I have a knee injury from a medical need." Kayla's professional smile didn't fade, but there was a small pause. "I understand, sir, but we'd really appreciate your cooperation. It's just for this one flight." Frank was quiet. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He simply knew that sitting in any other seat would mean 5 hours of pain. He glanced toward the front of the plane and saw the mother holding a toddler, with 2 other children nearby. He understood the situation. "Still," he asked, "what's the alternative?" Kayla tapped on her screen. "We can offer you seat 3B," she said. "It's a middle seat near the back." Frank blinked. A middle seat near the lavatories. He knew what that meant: tight space, no legroom, no relief. "I'm sorry," he said quietly but firmly. "I can't sit back there. My leg won't make it." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. People nearby started to take notice. Rows fell, quiet, and eyes turned toward the old man. To some, it looked like he was being uncooperative, maybe even selfish. The weight of silent judgment hung in the air, pressing down on him. Frank could feel it. He wasn't just a man protecting his comfort anymore. He was being painted as a problem. Kayla, maintaining her calm voice, replied, "If you choose not to move, we may not be able to depart on time." Frank's jaw tightened. He looked around, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, and with effort, he unbuckled his seatbelt. "Name's Frank Delaney," he said. "Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. I'd like it noted that I gave up a medically necessary seat under pressure." Kayla nodded without saying much and motioned for the family to move forward. As Frank gathered his bag and walked slowly down the aisle, he passed the mother and her children. The toddler looked up and gave him a smile. Frank nodded back gently. He didn't show any anger or frustration, just quiet resignation. Seat 3B was everything he had feared. It was tight, sandwiched between a college student wearing headphones and a businessman who immediately claimed the armrest. The air smelled like cleaning fluid and stale coffee. The overhead light was broken. Frank lowered himself carefully, his knee bending more than it should. He winced in silence. No one helped. No one even noticed. While most passengers focused on their screens or ignored what had just happened, one woman noticed everything. She sat 3 rows ahead of Frank, across the aisle. Her name was Charlotte Hayes. In her 40s, wearing a blazer and professional demeanor. She had boarded just before Frank and had heard the entire exchange. She watched how he moved, how he struggled to sit, how his hands scarred and stiff rested quietly in his lap. She saw the exhaustion in his posture, the discomfort in every small shift of his body. Charlotte didn't take out her laptop again. Instead, she reached for her phone and typed a message to a contact in the airline's corporate office. "Passenger Frank Delaney, forced to give up aisle seat 14C, despite confirmed booking and medical need. Now, in 32B Flight 306. Crew dismissive. Please escalate." She didn't know if anything would come of it, but some moments demand action, even if no one else is speaking up. Frank sat still, shoulders hunched. Every few minutes he adjusted his leg to avoid pain locking into place. The college student beside him stayed lost in a movie, and the businessman tapped away on his laptop, elbows sprawling into Frank's space. No one made eye contact. Frank wasn't angry, just tired. This wasn't the first time he had been made to feel like an inconvenience, and likely wouldn't be the last. As the final boarding checks were completed, Charlotte's phone buzzed with a reply, forwarding to ops. Unacceptable. Will notify cabin if escalated. The aircraft doors closed. The safety briefing began. Frank leaned back and shut his eyes, not paying attention to the pre-flight announcements. Instead, his mind wandered back to places and memories he rarely visited. The sound of boots in the jungle, a comrade's scream, the exact moment his knee was shattered in combat. His body might have healed, but the echoes remained. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain David Miller went over the final checklist with his co-pilot, a former Air Force pilot with over 11,000 flight hours. David was a man of precision. But then a red alert flashed on his console. A passenger concern reported from a corporate liaison. He read the name aloud. Frank Delaney. It stopped him cold. Delaney, that name meant something to him. And the note below, it confirmed it. Decorated veteran removed from his seat due to a policy mistake. The captain turned to his co-pilot and gave a direct order. Hold taxi. I'll be back in 3 minutes. Captain David Miller stepped into the cabin. His presence was powerful, measured steps. Clean uniform, gold stripes shining on his sleeves. Passengers instinctively fell silent. Phones lowered. Conversations stopped. Everyone felt something important was happening, even if they didn't know why. David walked to row 32. Frank Delaney looked up, startled by the sudden shadow. He wasn't sure what to expect. The captain stopped, stood tall, and in a clear and formal motion, raised his right hand in salute. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, the captain said in a strong, unwavering voice, on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines and as a fellow serviceman, I offer you my deepest apologies. The cabin was completely silent. You should not have been asked to move from your seat, the captain continued. It was an error, and we're going to make it right. Kayla, the young flight attendant who had moved Frank earlier, was called forward. She stood nervously as David spoke again. You will personally escort Staff Sergeant Delaney to seat 1A, he said. Kayla hesitated. Captain, first class is if 1A is occupied, David said. You will ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, you'll explain that the captain of this aircraft is requesting that seat on behalf of a decorated combat veteran. Frank tried to stand, but the captain gently raised a hand. Please, let us correct this. We owe you that much. The passengers watched in awe as Frank was helped to the front of the plane. Some clapped quietly, others bowed their heads. Even the children who had taken his original seats seemed to understand. Something special had happened. Charlotte Hayes watched it all unfold. She had no idea her small action would lead to such a public moment of justice. She smiled softly as Frank walked by, saluted again by the captain before taking his new seat. In first class, seat 1A, no words passed between them, none were needed. Charlotte sat back in her seat, breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what part of her had needed to see that happen, but she knew something deepened. Her chest had just settled, the kind of settling that happens when justice long delayed finally stands up. The moment Frank Delaney stepped into the aisle, something happened. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. People moved the business. Manuel hadn't given him a second glance. No, shifted awkwardly eyes. Lowered. The young man in the window seat stood up quickly, muttering, Sir, sorry sir. Though Frank hadn't asked for anything, Captain Miller didn't let go of Frank's elbow until he was steady. Then he looked toward Kalau, stood frozen halfway down the Islar tablet, clutched like a shield. Miss Bennett, he said calmly. Sat 1L. Yes, Captain, she replied, voicemailer. Then before she stepped forward, letting the way, Frank followed slowly, painfully. Every step stiff, careful. That knee hadn't been right in 50 years, probably, never would be. But now he walked with dignity, and every row Hepus felt it. Passengers turned, some murmured, others simply watched, and one man, middle-aged ball cap on his near, edged up and touched his chest with Anapan palm, a silent salute. Charlotte Hayes sat still, hands folded in her lap, breath held. She didn't reach for her phone this time, she just watched, iceful. The plane wasn't in motion, but something had shifted when they reached Hetero 1. Kayla stopped. She turned toward passenger already seated in 1A. A man in a pressed polo, sipping from a branded water bottle, oblivious to the drama behind him. I'm sorry, sir. She said, voice hesitant. We need to reassign your... The man blinked, confused. Wait, what? Captain's request. She said, head turned, and saw the stripes on Thorn Duffel, the age in his face, that quiet exhaustion. The man nodded. Didn't ask questions, he just stood, sir. He said to Frank quietly, it's Anne. Frank didn't know what to say. Hedges dipped his head. Grateful. Captain Miller turned to Kayla again. If that seat had not been given, I would have resigned my co-pilot's jump seat. Hesed loud enough for the first 6 rosto here, and if that wasn't available, He paused. I would have given up. Michaela's mouth parted slightly, but she said nothing. The statement wasn't for her. It was for everyone listening, and they were all listening now. Frank lowered himself into the spacious leather seat of 1A. It wasn't just the extra leg room, it was the angle of its quiet, the dignity. The crew brought them a blanket, a fresh bottle of water, an apology, but that wasn't what broke him. It was the voice from halfway down the aisle. A young man stood tall, late 30, shaved head, wearing jeans and a hoodie. His voice shook when he spoke. Staff Sergeant Delaney. Frank turned his head. Eyes are vet under you, the man said. Camp Leatherneck, 2006. Frank stared, then slowly his expression softened. Corporal Reeves, the man said. You saved my life, we never got. Thank you. His voice cracked. He blinked rapidly, tried to say more. Philed just nodded, chest heaving, and sat down. Again, tears streamed silently down his face. Frank looked away. Jaw set, but silence around him had changed again. This time, it wasn't silence born from discomfort, it was reverence. Captain Miller stepped into the intercom. Alcove adjusted the switch and spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice rang through the cabin, steady and deliberate. Before wet apart, I need to make a brief announcement. Every head turned today. A mistake was made. A man who served this country, who carries the visible and invisible scars of that service, was used to give up his seat, not because of an error, but because of a police he thought prioritizes convenience over honor. Paused, let the words hang. Let me be clear, we will not take off while injustice sits quietly in our cabin. A hush swept the plane. He continued. He Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He fought in Quezon, Vietnam. He has worn the uniform longer than most of us. Chauvet drawn breath. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply asked to keep the seat he booked so his leg wouldn't lock up from a service injury. Another beat. We failed him. Davis' voice softened, but it didn't waver. But don't leave our own behind. Not in combat, not at 30,000 feet. He looked down the aisle toward Charlotte, toward the veteran still quietly crying to roast by hand, her toward the passengers who hadn't looked away but now sat straighter. And if that means this flight runs 10 minutes late, he said, then I'll take every one of those minutes with pride. He clicked off the mic, and the cabin, already breathless, broke into applause. Not loud, not forced. It began with one pair of hands, then another, until row by row, section by section, it trolled like a wave. Frank didn't raise his hand, didn't bow his head. He just sat there, still, silencing. Charlotte wiped the corner of her eye, and for the first time in years, she believed something she had almost forgotten. Honor doesn't fade, it just waits for the right moment to rise again. The plane landed just after noon, in Annapolis, Maryland. The wheels kissed the runway with a gentle hum, and sunlight filtered through the windows like aqua blessing as passengers gathered their belongings and rose from their seats. Frank Delaney remained seated in 1A, hands resting calmly on his knees. He wasn't in a hurry. For once, he didn't feel forgotten when the flight crew. It wasn't just about a better seat. It was about being seen, about being respected, about remembering that behind every gray head or tired limp is a lifetime of stories and sacrifices. As Frank settled into seat 1A, the cabin still buzzed with quiet awe. It wasn't every day that passengers saw a captain stop an entire flight, walk down the aisle, and salute someone. For many, it was a moment that would stay with them for a long time. The mood had changed. What had started as an uncomfortable situation now felt like something bigger, something meaningful. The first-class attendant, a soft-spoken woman named Heather, gently helped Frank with his seatbelt. Would you like some water, sir? She asked kindly. Frank nodded, still unsure what to say. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. His life had never been about recognition. It had been about duty, survival, and moving forward without complaint. As the plane began taxiing again, Charlotte Hayes let out a slow breath. She had simply done what she felt was right. But seeing that moment unfold, seeing the salute, the dignity restored, she realized that small actions sometimes create huge waves. The businessman in seat 32A, who had barely glanced at Frank earlier, now looked ashamed. Even the college student pulled off his headphones and asked the person next to him, did that really just happen? As the engines roared and the aircraft lifted off the runway, Frank looked out the window. For a few minutes, there was only silence and sky. He felt the familiar pull of takeoff in his chest. But this time, it wasn't the motion that stirred him, it was the emotion. His mind drifted. Not back to the awkward walk down the aisle or the pain of seat 3B, but much further. He thought of his time in Vietnam, where he was barely 22, with a squad of other young men looking to him for guidance. He thought of the days where sleep came in bursts and fear was always at his back. He thought of a friend named Jimmy who never made it home. And he thought of the letter he wrote to Jimmy's parents the day after he died. A letter he never had the courage to send. Frank had never asked for medals or parades. Like many veterans, he had come home, found a job, started a family, and kept going. His knee injury had lingered, a quiet reminder of everything he'd given up. But what hurt more over time was something deeper, a feeling that people had forgotten. That service had become a story people remembered on Veterans Day, not in real life. Until now. About an hour into the flight, Heather returned with a hot towel and a warm smile. Captain Miller asked if he could join you for a moment after we reach cruising altitude. Only if you're okay with it. Frank nodded. Of course. A few minutes later, Captain David Miller appeared again, this time less formal, though his presence was no less commanding. He knelt beside Frank's seat, not to give orders but to speak man to man. I recognized your name, he said. I read about your service years ago. You led a team that pulled 3 wounded Marines out under fire. Frank gave a small shrug. That was a long time ago. David shook his head. Not to us, not to people who serve. I wanted to say this in person. What happened back there shouldn't have happened. You were disrespected, and I'm sorry. Frank's voice was quiet. You didn't have to come back there. David smiled. I did. We're all crew out here, sir, and you earned your seat a long time ago. The 2 men shook hands. No more needed to be said. As word of what happened made its way through the cabin, passengers began to reflect. A young father sitting in coach leaned over to his son and whispered, "That's what a real hero looks like." A college student opened a note-taking app and started writing a post about what she had just witnessed. A grandmother dabbed her eyes with a napkin and smiled to herself. It wasn't just about an old man or a fancy seat. It was about honor and how easy it is for the world to forget unless we remind each other. Even Kayla, the flight attendant, who had initially asked Frank to move, took a moment during the drink service to stop at seat 1A. Her expression was different now, less forced, more human. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry, sir," she said. Frank looked up and gave a small nod. "Thank you. I know you were just doing your job." Her eyes misted still. I should have listened better. In that brief moment, something changed in her too. 5 hours later, Flight 306 began its descent into Baltimore. As the plane touched down, the passengers remained quiet, as if still processing what had happened. The usual